Dr. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just waiting for her delayed flight that day at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, but when a construction accident turned the terminal into a trauma center, 47 witnesses discovered something that would transform their understanding of surgical excellence. Elena Rodriguez sat quietly in the departure lounge at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, reviewing patient files on her tablet with focused concentration of someone who had spent 19 years mastering trauma surgery, emergency medicine, and critical care coordination that required split-second decision-making and understanding of complex medical procedures. At 45 years old, she carried herself with understated confidence that comes from accumulating over 12,000 hours of surgical experience, completing fellowships in trauma surgery and emergency medicine, and developing expertise that had earned her recognition as one of the most skilled trauma surgeons in the Midwest through innovative surgical techniques and patient outcomes. Her credentials included board certifications in general surgery and trauma surgery, fellowship training from Johns Hopkins and Massachusetts General Hospital, and professional achievements that qualified her to handle everything from routine surgical procedures to complex multi-trauma cases involving life-threatening injuries that required immediate surgical intervention and clinical coordination. Today's delayed flight to Denver was taking her to a national trauma surgery conference where she was scheduled to present groundbreaking research on emergency surgical protocols that had reduced trauma mortality rates by 40% through innovative treatment techniques she had developed during her medical career. Her casual jeans and comfortable sweater reflected her off-duty status rather than the surgical scrubs and white coat that typically identified her as a senior medical professional. Though her clinical knowledge and surgical expertise represented decades of rigorous training and practical experience that had saved hundreds of lives through precise diagnosis and treatment. Airport Security Officer Michael Thompson, a veteran employee with 8 years of airport experience, who had developed assumptions about passenger capabilities and medical expertise based on superficial observations rather than qualifications, observed Elena from across the terminal waiting area without recognizing the quiet confidence that characterized someone who regularly made life-and-death decisions in high-pressure surgical environments. Thompson's understanding of medical professionals and tendency to make judgments based on appearance led him to categorize Elena as an ordinary passenger despite the focused intensity and clinical mindset she maintained during routine travel situations. Without warning, a massive section of ceiling construction collapsed in the main terminal concourse as renovation work failed catastrophically, sending tons of concrete, steel beams, and debris crashing down onto the crowded passenger area below, where dozens of travelers were waiting for flights, creating an instant mass casualty situation that required immediate emergency medical response. The devastating accident trapped several construction workers beneath heavy debris while simultaneously injuring multiple passengers with severe lacerations, crush injuries, broken bones, and traumatic wounds that demanded immediate medical intervention. Screams and cries for help filled the terminal as dust and debris clouded the air, creating a chaotic emergency scene where injured victims lay scattered across the concourse with various degrees of trauma that required immediate medical assessment and prioritized treatment. "Help us! Someone please help!" shouted construction foreman Jake Sullivan as he tried desperately to free his trapped crew members from beneath massive concrete slabs that had pinned them in positions requiring immediate rescue and medical care. Elena immediately recognized the magnitude of the medical emergency and instinctively responded with clinical training and professional expertise that characterized someone who had spent nearly 2 decades managing complex trauma situations in hospital emergency departments, where multiple casualties required immediate coordination and surgical intervention. "I'm a trauma surgeon," she announced clearly as she approached the accident scene with professional authority. "I can provide emergency medical care and coordinate trauma response for these injured victims." Security Officer Thompson immediately intercepted Elena's approach with aggressive positioning and authoritative resistance, apparently believing that civilian passengers should be kept away from dangerous accident areas regardless of their potential medical qualifications. "Ma'am, you need to stay back and let our emergency personnel handle this situation," he directed with authority. "This is a dangerous accident scene that requires professional emergency response, not civilian intervention from passengers." Elena looked at Thompson with professional urgency and medical authority that should have immediately established her credibility during such a critical emergency situation. "Officer, I'm Dr. Elena Rodriguez, Chief of Trauma Surgery at Chicago Memorial Hospital," she explained with calm competence. "These victims have severe trauma injuries that require immediate medical assessment and emergency treatment to prevent fatal complications and ensure survival outcomes." Examined Elena's appearance and civilian attire with skepticism, making prejudiced assumptions about her medical qualifications based on superficial judgments rather than professional credentials during a critical emergency situation where lives hung in the balance and medical intervention could determine survival outcomes. "Lady, I don't see any medical identification, and you don't look like any doctor I've ever seen," he replied with dismissive authority that prioritized his understanding over potential life-saving medical expertise. "Our emergency protocols require that only authorized personnel with proper identification be allowed near accident scenes where safety and liability issues require strict control." Elena watched with growing concern as valuable treatment time slipped away while injured victims continued to suffer from trauma complications that required immediate assessment and emergency medical intervention that could prevent permanent disability or death from untreated injuries. "Officer Thompson, these trauma victims need immediate medical attention," she insisted with clinical authority. "I can provide emergency trauma care that could save lives, but time is critical during trauma situations where delayed treatment significantly increases mortality rates." Among the injured victims, construction worker Maria Santos lay trapped beneath a steel beam with signs of internal bleeding and potential spinal cord injury that required immediate medical evaluation and emergency stabilization to prevent paralysis or death from hemorrhagic shock. "Please, someone help me," Santos gasped weakly as her condition deteriorated with symptoms that any experienced trauma surgeon would recognize as requiring immediate surgical intervention and critical care management. Elena observed Santos's condition with professional alarm and clinical expertise that enabled her to immediately assess the severity of her injuries and understand the urgent need for emergency medical intervention. "That victim has signs of internal bleeding and potential spinal injury," she explained with medical precision. "Without immediate medical care, she could develop hemorrhagic shock or permanent neurological damage that could be prevented with proper trauma treatment." Thompson continued his systematic exclusion of medical expertise with stubborn adherence to institutional protocols that prioritized security procedures over emergency medical care during a critical situation where intervention could determine life and death outcomes. "Ma'am, I've told you repeatedly that you need to step back and let our trained emergency personnel handle this accident situation according to established protocols," he insisted with frustration and continued resistance to acknowledging potential medical expertise. As the trauma situation continued to deteriorate, with multiple victims showing signs of severe blood loss and life-threatening complications that required immediate medical intervention, other passengers and airport personnel began witnessing the developing conflict between Elena's medical knowledge and Thompson's systematic refusal to allow qualified medical assistance during a critical emergency where lives were clearly at stake. Dr. James Patterson, an orthopedic surgeon who had been traveling through the airport and observed the accident with growing medical concern, approached the emergency scene to support Elena's professional assessment and medical expertise while directly challenging the security officer's inappropriate exclusion of qualified medical personnel. "Officer, this woman is correct in her medical assessment," Patterson announced with professional authority and clinical credibility. "I'm also a physician, and I can confirm that these trauma victims require immediate medical care that should take priority over security protocols during life-threatening emergency situations." His professional endorsement and medical credentials created additional pressure for Thompson to acknowledge the need for medical intervention, though the security officer maintained his resistant stance with defensive justification. "Doctors, I appreciate your medical concerns, but we have established emergency protocols and liability issues that require us to wait for authorized emergency medical personnel with proper credentials and authorization," Thompson replied with bureaucratic authority that demonstrated his dangerous prioritizations of procedures over patient safety during critical medical emergencies. Elena watched with professional horror as Santos's condition visibly worsened, with signs of advancing shock and potential internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent irreversible complications or death. "This victim is developing hemorrhagic shock," she announced, with clinical urgency and medical expertise. "Her blood pressure is dropping, and she needs immediate emergency surgery to control internal bleeding and prevent fatal complications." More passengers began gathering around the accident scene with concern about the injured victims and growing confusion about why qualified medical professionals were being prevented from providing life-saving emergency care during such a critical situation. "Why won't they let the doctors help?" asked passenger Jennifer Walsh loudly enough for surrounding travelers to hear. "Can't they see that people are dying while they argue about procedures and protocols?" Airport Emergency Coordinator Lisa Chen, who had been responding to the accident report and arriving at the scene with growing concern about the severity of the injuries and need for immediate medical coordination, finally approached the situation with urgency about emergency medical response and patient care priorities. Coordinator Chen immediately assessed the medical emergency with decisive authority of someone who understood both the severity of trauma injuries and the critical importance of utilizing all available medical expertise during mass casualty situations that required immediate intervention and coordinated emergency response to prevent preventable deaths and optimize patient outcomes. "Officer Thompson, why are these medical professionals being prevented from providing emergency trauma care?" she demanded with concern and administrative authority. "We have multiple critically injured victims who need immediate medical attention, and we should be utilizing every qualified medical professional available during this emergency situation." Thompson attempted to justify his exclusionary policies with bureaucratic explanations that sounded increasingly inadequate and potentially dangerous as the medical emergency continued to worsen and trauma victims required immediate intervention. "Coordinator Chen, I was following established security protocols that require proper identification and authorization before allowing civilian personnel access to emergency accident scenes," he replied with defensive posturing and discomfort about his decision-making during the critical medical situation. Chen immediately recognized the inappropriate prioritization of security procedures over emergency medical care and took decisive action to ensure that qualified medical professionals could provide life-saving trauma treatment. "Dr. Rodriguez," she said, with immediate respect and professional gratitude after quickly reviewing Elena's medical credentials and trauma surgery qualifications. Please take immediate medical control of this emergency situation and coordinate trauma care for all injured victims. We need your medical knowledge and surgical expertise to save lives and prevent preventable complications. Elena immediately assumed medical command of the trauma emergency with confident expertise and clinical competence that characterized someone who regularly managed complex, multi-casualty situations in hospital trauma centers where coordinated emergency response and surgical intervention determined patient survival outcomes. I need immediate medical supplies and emergency equipment, she directed with professional authority and medical knowledge. We have multiple trauma victims requiring emergency stabilization and potential surgical intervention to control bleeding and prevent fatal complications. Her immediate demonstration of medical expertise and clinical leadership created confidence among emergency responders and airport personnel who recognized that they were now being directed by someone whose qualifications and experience were specifically designed for managing this type of complex trauma emergency. Patient with potential internal bleeding requires immediate assessment and emergency intervention, she announced while quickly triaging victims according to injury, severity, and treatment priority. Rodriguez assumed complete medical control of the emergency response. Her trauma surgery expertise and clinical skills became immediately apparent to everyone involved in the rescue operations as she deployed sophisticated triage protocols, implemented precise emergency treatment procedures, and directed comprehensive trauma care that demonstrated the level of medical knowledge and practical experience. Multiple trauma victims require immediate priority assessment based on injury, severity, and survival probability, she explained with clinical precision and medical authority that established her expertise beyond any doubt. I'm implementing trauma life support protocols and emergency surgical procedures to control bleeding and prevent fatal complications. Her detailed medical knowledge and confident emergency intervention techniques revealed the depth of her trauma surgery expertise as she quickly stabilized multiple victims through application of trauma care protocols that required years of specialized training and practical experience to execute effectively during high-pressure emergency situations. Patient with crush injuries showing signs of compartment syndrome requiring immediate surgical intervention, she continued, while managing multiple critical cases with professional competence and clinical expertise. I'm performing emergency fasciotomy to prevent permanent tissue damage and limb loss from pressure-related complications. The precision and effectiveness of her medical intervention created immediate improvement in victim conditions as her trauma care began to stabilize injuries and prevent the fatal complications that had been developing without proper medical treatment. Hemorrhage is controlled, and vital signs are stabilizing with emergency surgical intervention, she announced with professional satisfaction and medical relief. Multiple victims are responding well to trauma care, and we've successfully prevented several potential fatalities through immediate medical intervention. Emergency medical technicians and paramedics who arrived at the scene watched with professional respect and medical admiration as Elena's trauma surgery expertise and emergency coordination transformed a potentially catastrophic mass casualty situation into a managed medical emergency through application of trauma protocols and surgical intervention techniques. Dr. Rodriguez, said EMT Captain Rodriguez with professional gratitude, your trauma coordination and surgical intervention have been exceptional and undoubtedly saved multiple lives through medical care and precise clinical decision-making. Airport personnel and passengers observed with amazement as Elena's medical expertise and life-saving intervention demonstrated the critical importance of recognizing and utilizing qualified medical professionals during emergency situations. Elena's comprehensive trauma management continued with increasingly sophisticated medical procedures as she simultaneously coordinated emergency care for multiple critically injured victims while performing complex surgical interventions that required advanced technical skills and clinical experience that could only be acquired through years of specialized training in high-volume trauma centers. Patient with penetrating abdominal injury requiring immediate exploratory surgery to identify and repair internal organ damage, she explained, while performing emergency surgical procedures in the improvised medical area that had been established in the terminal concourse. I'm conducting emergency laparotomy to control intra-abdominal bleeding and prevent fatal hemorrhagic complications. Her surgical precision and clinical expertise became increasingly apparent as she managed complex trauma cases that would challenge even experienced emergency physicians, demonstrating medical knowledge and technical competence that characterized someone who regularly performed life-saving surgery under the most challenging conditions. Successful repair of liver laceration and control of intra-abdominal hemorrhage, she announced while completing emergency surgical procedures with professional competence and expertise. Patient is stable and ready for transport to definitive surgical care with prognosis for full recovery. The complexity and success of her surgical interventions created growing recognition among all emergency responders about the medical expertise and trauma surgery capabilities that Elena possessed, transforming initial skepticism and discrimination into profound professional respect and gratitude for life-saving medical intervention. "Dr. Rodriguez," said paramedic supervisor Martinez with professional admiration, "your surgical skills and trauma expertise are remarkable, and your emergency interventions have prevented what could have been multiple fatalities during this catastrophic accident." Elena continued her medical coordination while maintaining professional focus on patient care and outcomes, directing continued emergency treatment with clinical authority and medical competence that had made her one of the most respected trauma surgeons in the regional medical community. "All critical patients are now stabilized and ready for transport to trauma centers," she reported with professional satisfaction and medical confidence. Thompson, who had been observing Elena's medical expertise and life-saving surgical intervention from a distance with growing professional embarrassment and personal shame about his discriminatory behavior, finally approached the medical area with remorse and belated recognition of his serious misjudgment. As emergency medical transport teams prepared to evacuate the stabilized trauma victims to hospitals for continued care, the full scope of Dr. Rodriguez's medical qualifications and professional achievements became apparent to everyone involved in the emergency response as they witnessed the direct result of trauma surgery and emergency medical coordination that had prevented multiple fatalities and ensured patient outcomes. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Emergency Coordinator Chen with pride and professional gratitude, "I want everyone to understand that Dr. Elena Rodriguez has just demonstrated the most trauma surgery expertise and emergency medical coordination that I have witnessed in 20 years of emergency management." The recognition created immediate appreciation among all emergency responders, airport personnel, and passengers who understood that they had witnessed medical intervention performed by someone whose qualifications and expertise exceeded anything they had previously encountered during emergency situations. Construction foreman Sullivan, whose crew members had been saved by Elena's medical intervention, approached her with tears of gratitude and profound appreciation for her life-saving surgical care. "Dr. Rodriguez, you saved my workers' lives," he said with emotion and heartfelt gratitude. "Without your surgical expertise and immediate medical intervention, we would have lost good people today, and our families will be forever grateful for your skill and dedication." Elena continued monitoring her patients' conditions with professional dedication and medical focus while graciously accepting the recognition and gratitude for her emergency surgical intervention and trauma care coordination. The most important thing is that all victims received appropriate emergency medical care and will make full recoveries, she replied with characteristic professional humility and medical compassion. I was simply applying the trauma surgery expertise and emergency medical knowledge that I use every day at Chicago Memorial Hospital. Dr. Patterson stepped forward to provide additional context about Elena's medical qualifications and professional reputation that had made her life-saving intervention possible during the catastrophic emergency. I want everyone to know that Dr. Rodriguez is not just any trauma surgeon, he announced with professional respect and medical admiration. She is one of the nation's leading trauma surgery specialists and chief of trauma surgery at Chicago Memorial Hospital, whose innovative surgical techniques and research have revolutionized emergency trauma care and saved thousands of lives through medical procedures. The moment Dr. Rodriguez completed her comprehensive trauma surgery intervention and successfully stabilized all critically injured victims through medical care and surgical procedures, the scope of her medical authority and professional accomplishments became undeniably apparent to everyone involved in the emergency response, as they recognized the direct correlation between surgical expertise and patient survival outcomes. "Everyone needs to understand," announced Airport Director Williams, who had arrived at the scene to assess the emergency response and coordinate with medical authorities, "that Dr. Elena Rodriguez has just provided the most trauma surgery and emergency medical coordination in our airport's history, saving multiple lives through surgical expertise that represents the highest standards of medical excellence and professional competence." The announcement created immediate institutional recognition and systemic appreciation for the medical expertise that had transformed a potential catastrophe into a successful emergency response through surgical intervention and trauma care coordination. Thompson, who had been witnessing Elena's surgical skills and life-saving medical intervention with growing professional horror about his discriminatory behavior, finally understood the magnitude of his mistake and the medical professional whose expertise he had so inappropriately excluded based on prejudiced assumptions rather than recognition of surgical qualifications and medical authority. "Dr. Rodriguez," he said, with profound remorse and professional respect, "I cannot adequately express my regret for preventing your immediate medical intervention and questioning your surgical credentials. Your expertise saved lives that could have been lost due to my discriminatory assumptions and inappropriate resistance to qualified medical assistance." Elena focused on completing her patient care responsibilities with continued professional dedication while acknowledging the systemic recognition of her medical expertise and surgical authority. "Officer Thompson, the most important outcome is that all trauma victims received appropriate emergency medical care," she replied with professional grace and medical compassion. "What matters is that we prevented preventable deaths and ensured patient outcomes through coordinated emergency response and trauma surgery." Emergency Coordinator Chen stepped forward to provide comprehensive recognition of Elena's medical qualifications and the surgical intervention that had prevented a humanitarian disaster. "Dr. Rodriguez," she announced with professional pride and institutional gratitude, "is Chief of Trauma Surgery at Chicago Memorial Hospital, one of the nation's premier trauma centers, where her surgical innovations and emergency medical protocols have reduced trauma mortality rates and established new standards for emergency surgical care. This is why truth always comes to light, and justice always finds its way. If this story shows you that dignity and respect matter more than assumptions, make sure you subscribe to see more stories where justice prevails. Because when we stand together against discrimination, we make real change happen. Following the trauma surgery demonstration and undeniable evidence of how discriminatory assumptions could have resulted in preventable deaths during medical emergencies, Chicago O'Hare International Airport immediately initiated comprehensive reforms to emergency response protocols, medical personnel recognition procedures, and discrimination prevention measures that would ensure immediate identification and utilization of qualified medical professionals during emergency situations, while eliminating prejudiced judgments that could compromise patient safety and emergency medical care. Security Officer Thompson was immediately enrolled in mandatory diversity training and emergency medical response education that would address his discriminatory behavior and provide comprehensive understanding of medical emergency priorities and appropriate protocols for recognizing and supporting qualified medical professionals regardless of their appearance or civilian attire during off-duty travel. The incident became a catalyst for aviation industry discussions about discrimination in emergency medical situations, and the critical importance of recognizing medical expertise based on qualifications rather than superficial assumptions that could prevent life-saving intervention during critical situations where patient survival depended on immediate surgical care and trauma management. Elena's life-saving surgical intervention and trauma coordination became a model for effective emergency medical response throughout the aviation industry, as documentation and analysis of her surgical techniques spread across airport emergency networks and medical training programs, inspiring airports worldwide to improve their recognition procedures and ensure appropriate utilization of medical professionals during emergency situations. Within weeks of the incident, all construction workers had made complete recoveries from their injuries and personally thanked Elena for her life-saving surgical intervention, while Chicago O'Hare implemented new protocols requiring immediate recognition and support of qualified medical professionals during emergency situations, regardless of their travel status or civilian appearance. The transformation extended beyond individual airport policies to influence broader conversations about discrimination in emergency medical care. The importance of recognizing professional expertise, regardless of demographic characteristics, and the critical need for institutional changes that would ensure medical response during emergency situations that could determine life and death outcomes for trauma victims who depended on immediate surgical intervention. Medical organizations and aviation safety agencies recognized the incident as a powerful example of how discrimination could interfere with emergency medical care, and used Elena's experience to develop training programs and protocols that would prevent similar discrimination and ensure appropriate recognition of medical expertise during critical situations. Dr. Rodriguez's story became an inspiring example of how surgical knowledge and professional competence could triumph over institutional bias and discriminatory assumptions, while creating opportunities for systematic improvement in emergency medical care that benefited countless future emergency victims who might require surgical intervention during catastrophic accidents. But Dr. Rodriguez's story is just one example of how truth always comes to light in critical moments. Next video. Watch what happens when a black neurosurgeon's 16-year secret is revealed during a flight emergency. When crew refuses her help with a stroke patient, the most shocking medical credentials in aviation history are exposed. You won't believe what happens when brain surgery expertise meets discrimination. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and turn on notifications for new content. Don't forget to hit the like button if this story moved you, and share your thoughts and opinions about this situation in the comments below.